May 2, 1945, Oberammergau, Bavaria. American soldiers from the 44th Infantry Division entered a resort hotel commandeered by the Wehrmacht. Inside, they found not soldiers, but scientists. Over 400 German rocket engineers surrendered en masse, led by a 33-year-old technical director named Wernher von Braun. Von Braun's left arm was in a cast from a recent car accident. He approached the Americans and stated in English, "My name is von Braun. I am the man you are looking for." Within 5 months, these men would be working for the United States government. Their Nazi pasts would be systematically erased from official records. This is the documented history of Operation Paperclip, a classified U.S. program that recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians between 1945 and 1959. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency oversaw the operation. Records declassified in the 1980s and 1990s revealed the scope of what occurred. Nazi Party members, SS officers, and individuals who used slave labor were brought to America. Their backgrounds were sanitized. Their crimes were overlooked. The justification was simple. If America did not take these scientists, the Soviet Union would. What followed was not a simple story of redemption or scientific progress. It was a calculated decision that placed strategic advantage above accountability. These men would design the rockets that launched America's satellites. They would put Americans on the moon. This is what became of Hitler's rocket men, documented through declassified files, congressional investigations, and verified testimony. Peenemünde, on Germany's Baltic coast, was the Third Reich's primary rocket development facility. From 1937 through 1945, engineers there developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. The V-2 killed approximately 9,000 civilians and military personnel, primarily in London and Antwerp. But the production of these weapons killed far more. The Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, established in August 1943, supplied forced labor for V-2 production. Records from the camp document that over 60,000 prisoners were held there. At least 20,000 died from exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and executions. Wernher von Braun visited Mittelbau-Dora multiple times. Documents from the Nuremberg trials reference his presence at the facility. Former prisoners testified that von Braun personally selected workers from prisoner lineups. Von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party from 1937 and held the rank of SS Major. His membership records were obtained by Allied intelligence in 1945. When American forces approached in early 1945, von Braun made a decision. Rather than allow his team to fall into Soviet hands, he ordered the evacuation to southern Germany. He chose to surrender to the Americans. On May 3, 1945, von Braun's brother Magnus, also a rocket engineer, made contact with a U.S. Army private from the 324th Infantry Regiment. Within hours, the Counterintelligence Corps was notified. The scientists were initially taken to Garmisch-Partenkirchen for interrogation. What the Americans found was extraordinary. Complete technical documentation, wind tunnel data, and partially assembled V-2 rockets hidden throughout the Harz Mountains. By June 1945, the U.S. Army had shipped over 300 railcar loads of V-2 components to Antwerp, then by ship to New Orleans. The scientists themselves would follow by September. The question of what to do with men who built weapons using slave labor was about to be answered. President Truman signed Executive Order 9604 in August 1945, establishing the process for bringing foreign scientists to the United States. The order explicitly prohibited the entry of Nazi Party members or individuals who supported Nazi militarism. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, was assigned to vet candidates. Director Bosket Webb faced an immediate problem. Nearly all qualified German scientists had been Nazi Party members. Party membership was often required for government employment after 1933. The JIOA solution, documented in declassified memoranda from 1947, was to create sanitized personnel files. These files, called dossiers, omitted or minimized Nazi affiliations. In February 1947, JIOA Director Webb wrote to the State Department, "The best interests of the United States have been subjugated to the efforts expended in beating a dead Nazi horse." This memo is preserved in the National Archives. The State Department and Department of Justice initially resisted. They cited the Nuremberg Principles and existing immigration law. But pressure from the Department of Defense and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency prevailed. By 1948, the program was officially named Operation Paperclip, after the paperclips used to attach new backgrounds to the scientists' files. Over 1,600 German specialists would eventually enter the United States under this program. The largest group consisted of rocket engineers. But the program also included experts in aerodynamics, medicine, chemistry, and physics. Their destinations were military installations across America, Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and eventually, the newly formed NASA facilities in Alabama and Florida. September 1945. Von Braun and 126 German scientists arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas, under military custody. They were classified as wards of the Army. They could not leave the base without escort. They were not yet citizens. Their mission was clear: reassemble captured V-2 rockets and train American engineers in their operation. At White Sands Proving Ground, 100 miles north, the first American-launched V-2 lifted off on April 16, 1946. Over the next 6 years, 67 V-2 rockets would be launched there. Each test provided data on high-altitude flight, atmospheric conditions, and rocket performance. The German scientists lived in barracks on the base. Army intelligence monitored their mail and activities. Reports from 1946 note that several scientists attempted to contact family members still in Germany. Others requested better living conditions. By 1948, restrictions began to ease. Scientists were allowed to bring family members to the United States. They were given housing in El Paso. Their children attended American schools. Congressional testimony from 1949 reveals growing concern about the program. Representative John Dingell of Michigan questioned the Army on why Nazi scientists were employed while American veterans struggled to find work. The Army's response, documented in the Congressional record, emphasized national security. The Soviet Union had captured German scientists working at Peenemünde. Intelligence reports confirmed the Soviets were developing their own ballistic missile program using German expertise. The argument prevailed. Operation Paperclip continued. But not all Germans adapted to American life. Declassified FBI files from the 1950s document that several scientists attempted to return to Germany. Others were investigated for potential espionage or maintaining contact with former SS colleagues in South America. Most, however, integrated. They learned English. They became naturalized citizens. And they began working on projects that would define the Cold War space race. Arthur Rudolph served as operations director of the Mittelwerk factory at Mittelbau-Dora, where V-2 rockets were assembled by concentration camp prisoners. His role was documented in affidavits collected during the Nuremberg trials. Former prisoners testified that Rudolph was present during selections and had authority over working conditions. A French prisoner, Georges Joannin, testified that Rudolph witnessed hangings of prisoners accused of sabotage. Rudolph entered the United States in 1945 under Operation Paperclip. His dossier, declassified in 1984, showed that his Nazi Party membership and role at Mittelbau-Dora had been documented by Army intelligence, but were excluded from his immigration file. At Fort Bliss and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Rudolph worked on the Redstone and Jupiter missiles. In 1960, he became project director for the Saturn V rocket program, the vehicle that would carry Apollo astronauts to the moon. In 1969, NASA awarded Rudolph the Distinguished Service Medal for his work on the Saturn V. The citation praised his exceptional leadership and outstanding contributions. In 1979, the Office of Special Investigations, a unit within the Department of Justice created to investigate Nazi war criminals, began reviewing Operation Paperclip participants. In 1982, OSI investigators interviewed Rudolph about his activities at Mittelbau-Dora. Transcripts from these interviews, now public, show Rudolph initially denied knowledge of prisoner mistreatment. When confronted with witness testimony and documents, he acknowledged his presence at the facility, but claimed he had no authority to improve conditions. In 1984, facing possible denaturalization proceedings, Rudolph agreed to renounce his U.S. citizenship and leave the country. He returned to West Germany. The case generated significant media attention. The New York Times published multiple articles questioning how Rudolph had been employed by NASA for nearly 25 years despite documented evidence of his activities. Rudolph died in Hamburg in 1996. He never faced trial. He maintained until his death that he was not responsible for the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora. His case was not unique. Declassified documents identify at least a dozen Operation Paperclip scientists with documented connections to forced labor or medical experiments. Hubertus Strughold directed the Luftwaffe's aviation medicine research at the Aviation Medical Research Institute in Berlin. After the war, he was brought to the United States and became known as the father of space medicine. Strughold's name appears in documents related to medical experiments conducted at the Dachau concentration camp. In 1942, the Luftwaffe conducted high-altitude and hypothermia experiments on prisoners to determine survival limits for pilots. A 1947 report by U.S. Air Force investigators noted Strughold's attendance at a 1942 conference where these experiments were discussed. The report is held at the National Archives. Strughold consistently denied involvement in or knowledge of unethical experiments. He stated in a 1949 affidavit that he focused on theoretical research and did not conduct human experiments. At Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, Strughold established the Department of Space Medicine in 1949. His research on the physiological effects of spaceflight directly contributed to Project Mercury, America's first human spaceflight program. In 1962, Strughold received the Aerospace Medical Association's most prestigious award. The association later renamed the award after discovering documentation of his connection to Nazi medical research. In 2013, the award's name was changed, removing Strughold's name. Strughold died in 1986 in San Antonio, Texas. Files declassified after his death revealed that Air Force intelligence had known of his attendance at conferences discussing human experiments but determined his technical expertise was too valuable to exclude him from Operation Paperclip. The ethical questions raised by Strughold's case remain unresolved. His defenders note the lack of direct evidence linking him to conducting experiments. His critics point to his position and documented presence at meetings where experiments were planned and results discussed. Wernher von Braun became the public face of America's space program. In 1950, von Braun and his team transferred from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. There, they developed the Redstone rocket, America's first large ballistic missile. Von Braun became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1955. That same year, He appeared on 3 episodes of the Walt Disney television series Tomorrowland, explaining rocket science to millions of American viewers. He was articulate, charismatic, and effective at communicating complex concepts. The public saw him as a visionary, not as a former SS officer. In 1960, von Braun became the first director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. Under his leadership, the center developed the Saturn family of rockets, including the Saturn V that launched the Apollo missions. When Apollo 11 landed on the Moon in July 1969, von Braun stood in the control room at Cape Kennedy. Photographs from that day show him smiling, arms raised in celebration. But by the early 1970s, questions about his Nazi past began receiving more attention. Investigative journalists uncovered documents showing his SS membership and his visits to Mittelbau-Dora. Von Braun maintained that he joined the SS to continue his research, not out of ideological commitment. In a 1976 interview, he stated, "I was officially demanded to join the National Socialist Party. My refusal would have meant that I would have to abandon the work of my life." He died in 1977 from pancreatic cancer. His legacy remains contested, celebrated by some as the chief architect of the Saturn V, condemned by others as complicit in slavery and war crimes. The United States was not alone in recruiting German scientists. The Soviet Union conducted similar operations. In October 1946, the Soviet military forcibly relocated over 2,200 German specialists and their families to the Soviet Union. This operation, codenamed Azovy Akim, targeted scientists who had remained in the Soviet occupation zone. Among them was Helmut Gertrup, a lead engineer at Peenemünde who had worked directly with von Braun. Gertrup was sent to Gorodomlya Island on Lake Seliger, where German engineers were detained and required to recreate V-2 technology for Soviet use. Declassified Soviet documents show that by 1947, the Soviets had launched their first reconstructed V-2. By 1950, Soviet engineers had developed their own designs, and the German specialists were deemed less essential. Most German scientists in Soviet custody were allowed to return to East Germany by 1954. Unlike their counterparts in America, few achieved lasting prominence. The Soviet government minimized foreign contributions to its space program. The competition between these two groups of German-trained engineers drove the Cold War space race. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, President Eisenhower turned to von Braun's team to respond. The result was Explorer 1, launched on January 31, 1958, by a Jupiter C rocket developed at Redstone Arsenal. America's space program had begun, powered by technology and expertise that traced directly back to Peenemünde. Operation Paperclip officially ended in 1959, though individual scientists continued arriving through the 1960s. By the program's conclusion, the U.S. government had recruited over 1,600 specialists. The program's legacy is complex and remains controversial. On one hand, Operation Paperclip directly enabled American achievements in space exploration and military technology. The Saturn V rocket, developed under von Braun's leadership, remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The scientific knowledge gained from German expertise accelerated U.S. development by an estimated 5 to 10 years. On the other hand, the program required overlooking documented participation in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The decision to sanitize records and bypass immigration law established a precedent that national security interests could override legal and ethical considerations. In 1984, congressional hearings examined Operation Paperclip following the Arthur Rudolph case. Testimony revealed the extent to which Army intelligence and the GIOA had knowingly falsified background files. Representative Elizabeth Holtzman of New York stated, "Our government made a deal with the devil." And the devil's price was paid by concentration camp victims whose suffering was never acknowledged. The Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations investigated multiple Operation Paperclip participants through the 1980s and 1990s. Several cases resulted in denaturalization or voluntary departure. However, most scientists lived out their lives in the United States without legal consequences. Many received honors and awards for their contributions to American science and national defense. Today, NASA and the Department of Defense acknowledge the program's ethical complexities. A 2014 NASA historical publication stated, "The decision to employ these men was controversial then and remains so. It reflected the priorities of a nation emerging from war into an uncertain peace." The last surviving Operation Paperclip scientist, Georg von Tiesenhausen, died in 2018 at age 104. He had worked on the Saturn rocket program and later became a patents officer at NASA. In his later years, von Tiesenhausen spoke publicly about the program. In a 2013 oral history interview archived at the University of Alabama, he stated, "We knew we had done things in service of a terrible regime. Coming to America gave us a chance to do something good with what we knew. Whether that makes up for what came before, I cannot say." The documents, testimonies, and records of Operation Paperclip remain accessible to researchers. They stand as evidence of a decision that shaped the course of the Cold War and the space age. A decision made not in pursuit of justice, but in pursuit of advantage. What became of Hitler's rocket men was determined not by their pasts, but by their usefulness to a nation racing toward the future.